Hi there. I just wanted to take a few moments to quickly review the lecture we had at the end of the day so that you're well set up to do your posters on media and stigma. So we talked a little bit today about different ways that the media can influence our perceptions, and the next two slides look at that. The first thing I want to remind you is that we are the media. The media is selling us something, whether it's space to advertise our store or our business, or the actual newspaper or newscast itself. The media needs us to be able to sell its newspaper advertising or the commercial spaces, and if we don't want to watch things about mental illness, then they wouldn't try to put things in that context. So this is an important thing for us to think about. If we're a business that's looking to advertise in the newspaper, we can influence that newspaper by telling the newspaper what we're comfortable having being positioned by our business advertisement. The same thing if we're using a particular radio station or newspaper, or television news station. And as consumers, the choices we make, for example, whether we tune into a particular newscast or whether we buy a certain newspaper, or the feedback that we give, something as simple as a quick message on somebody's answering machine or a Facebook note or a quick email, can really shape the way that the media actually decides to describe things and what it covers. We must also remember something else, and that is a lot of what the newspapers and the news stations discuss comes from the community itself. So what tips are you sending their way? What input are you giving to the actual content? Which takes us to the next thing. The media can influence perceptions of mental health very, very simply by deciding what gets into the newspaper in and of itself. If the only time that mental illness gets discussed is in the context of crime or violence, then that's the perceptions that the community is going to get. If there are examples in our community of people doing well while experiencing mental health symptoms, or of overcoming adversity as a result of mental health, or of mental health programs that are designed to prevent mental illness, those stories getting covered is going to help to shape the positive perspective of mental illness and mental health care. So this very simple idea of what actually makes its way into the news is critically important, and it's true all over the world that people fight to make sure their stories get media airtime. Sometimes it's remarkable. We can find out that years or even longer after a story happened that it was never really discussed. There was just simply no reporter who felt it was worth covering, and yet it might have been a remarkable event. Not just ones that have to do with mental health, by the way. The prominence, once something is covered, is also important, meaning how far at the front of the newspaper might you find it, or how close to the beginning of the newscast is it? How much airtime is it actually given, or page time is it given? How big is the actual headline? Clearly, the more airtime a story gets, the more prominence it has, the more it's going to influence us. If it's a story that takes a positive outlook or an informed outlook about mental health, then it's going to have an impact that's positive. If it's one that makes the story more sensationalized, that's going to be an issue that affects mental illness negatively. Language is another one. Most people are quick to see that language can be an influencer of our stigma. The words that we use, some of them sensationalized, as I said. That word sensationalized, I would encourage you to look it up. But it means that we are adding an emotional valent to words that exaggerates the words or gives them perhaps an unfair value or weight. Some of the time, the words that we use are used inaccurately. They simply aren't the right word for what we're describing. I showed you an example in class of the word schizophrenic being used to describe a position where the person had divided responsibilities, and the word schizophrenic was inaccurately used to describe that. And that can be an insidious influence. And you remember we talked about insidious meaning sneaky, that something can be subtle and influence us gradually without us even noticing that that's happening. Finally, we also talked about the way some words can romanticize mental illness and breed sympathy instead of empathy. So when we romanticize something, again, we're giving it an emotional valent, but we're not so much trying to make people think something is bad or get them angry. We're just simply trying to make people feel sympathetic or sad or sorry for other individuals. And again, that doesn't at first strike us as being an insulting or undignified way to handle things. But if you're a person who has mental health needs, you might start to understand that it's only a part of who you are, and that if everybody thinks of you as somebody who needs sympathy or has a sad life, they probably aren't giving you a very well-rounded kind of perspective. This slide's a little bit more difficult to read, but it also talks about some continuing on other ways the media influence us, the images that are used. And again, very much like the words that we talked about, the image chosen can tell us a lot about the way the author wanted to shape our perceptions. They might have chosen images of an individual that showed them in a weakened state or a strong state. They might show people that are being dignified, or they might show people in a way that's very difficult for us to relate to. For example, if I see a picture of a person who's homeless when they are on the road to recovery, I might see that there's a reason to be hopeful and a reason to see that people are deserving of dignity. On the other hand, if I show a picture of somebody who's dirty and scrubbing for food in the bottom of a dumpster, it would be easy to understand why somebody might not be able to relate to that individual, might not be able to care about that individual. The content itself within the story also matters, because often reporters make choices about what they're going to include and what they're not going to include. A television story that goes for longer than 3 minutes would be considered remarkably long, and a newspaper story that takes up more than 1 or 2 columns is considered to be a major story. And what this means is that the editors of these particular types of news have to be very discriminating about what to include. They make choices about what they're going to keep in the story and also where in the story it comes. How often have you read a story and it said turn to page 2 for the rest of the story and you just didn't bother? So when something comes before the break, it's an editor's way of saying they think it's something that's more important, because they know that people are less likely to come back to the story when the page is turned or after the commercial. So they might, for example, choose to interview psychiatrists instead of patients, or neighbors who've been dealing with homeless individuals rather than advocates for people who are homeless. So just a couple of examples of what might or might not make its way into the story, or the order that they might put things in the story. Whether or not a story is opinion or journalism also matters. Within our newspapers in particular, there are often a blend of journalistic articles, which are news. Journalism has a code of ethics, and those ethics include the idea that it must be based on facts, it must have reliable sources, and the author of the story, the journalist, must make every effort to tell the story objectively. But when a person is writing an opinion column, there is an entirely different way of writing being involved. The idea now is for them to express their opinion, their own personal opinion, and not at all to be objective. There may be very few facts that are brought to bear, or the columnist might be focused on 1 or 2 facts completely to the negligence of others. It's really up to us when we read an opinion column to decide whether we agree or disagree. But many people don't stop and see the difference between an opinion column and a journalistic article. And even further complicating things, the media often publishes things that are neither. And that's especially true when they talk about celebrity gossip. So gossip often comes from unnamed sources, so there's really no journalistic integrity. And they often tell things which are very biased and judgmental sounding. And in some cases, entire publications try to make gossip look like news. You've probably seen some of them as you're standing at the grocery store. So there is a great deal of difficulty in some cases being able to separate facts from reality when it comes to gossip. We also can look sometimes at a piece that we've read or that we see on the news, and we can tell that the person who wrote it purposely was trying to influence us in a particular way. And that might be that they're trying to get us to laugh, that the story has intentionally got some humor behind it, that they're trying to warn us that, for example, a new shelter or facilities being built in our neighborhood, or that tax dollars are going to be spent on mental health care. Maybe they're trying to breed action. Maybe they're trying to get people to protest a facility, or maybe they're trying to do the opposite and have people advocate for a facility, breed action in the community. Maybe they're trying to inspire hope by people who have a mental health disorder or who have somebody in their family that has a disorder. Or maybe they're simply trying to give helpful information to people. Remember, The media isn't always bad. It's often helpful. And in fact, I can tell you that in the time I've been working in this sector, I've seen the media evolve a great deal. And that goes back to the very first point we made in this lecture, and that is that the media is us. And so people more and more are communicating back to the media that they expect to see stories that are helpful and inspiring and truthful and objective and factual, and that are designed to have dignity and hope within them. One more evolution in how the media influence us is the way that the media itself has evolved. So we all know that social media is a big part of our lives now, and there are other forms of media that influence us as well. It's not always the news. When we turn on the radio and we listen to music, that's influencing us. And the messages within music shape us a great deal. More and more we see games, particularly electronic games, that shape how we look at things, and stories, whether they're children's stories or novels. Of course, we can talk about the stories within movies and television programs, and all of those various formats can shape perceptions. If we read stories that everybody comes to love, popular stories, and they're about people who have a mental health issue, then we start to change perhaps whether we see that type of disorder as being more relatable or whether or not we feel it's something that can be scary. So one of the things you were asked is, how does stigma actually affect the community? And we can look at that at the small level. How does the stigma affect people who have a mental health diagnosis, the individual level of a community, or their family, or the small circle around them? And in the next slide, we'll look at the larger community. So stigma can affect us because of when we go to get health care. If, for example, we're hesitant to go and get help because we think it has some negative social value and we have difficulty accepting the idea that we might need help, we're less likely to get good results. Just the same way as a person who had symptoms of cancer might get less effective results if they waited for a long time before going to the doctor. It's a truism that early intervention is good. And so if we have people can more quickly accept that they might need medical help, they probably would have better outcomes. We also know that it's very important for people to have support from other people when they're going through any kind of illness. And mental illness is not only not different, but might even be one where there's more support needed. So if people are afraid to talk to their family or their friends or their larger community, people often do the exact opposite of what they need when they have a mental health diagnosis, because they often are embarrassed and they withdraw, which can make their symptoms much worse and much harder to treat. So we want people to do the opposite, but it's very difficult because of the stigma attached to mental illness. It can also be difficult for people because their employers may not understand about their mental health needs, and it may cost them in terms of their job security. Maybe their employer doesn't keep them around or doesn't give them the best shifts or give them an opportunity for promotion. And of course, we know that when people have a lower income, it means that they have less access to the resources that give us all a good quality of life, and they might even be the sort of resources that help directly combat mental health needs. We also might not particularly participate in healthy self-care. For example, our willingness to take medications might be affected by stigma, because if medicine is seen to be connected with mental illness, and we don't want to be mentally ill, we don't want to take these medicines, maybe we're embarrassed to take them, or maybe we assume that they're bad for us. Maybe the act of participating in self-care is seen as something that only weak people do, and so we tend to want to stop doing it. And this is very, very common in services to people with mental health needs. And their desire to have a positive self-image can be in conflict with the need for them to do self-care. And this leads to a much higher level of relapse, meaning people are much more likely to have their mental health symptoms come back again, whether it's the use of drugs or alcohol for people who have addiction related disorders, or whether it's people who stop using a medicine for something like bipolar and then cycle back into a manic or depressed phase. And this means that people have a slower recovery or more downturns in the recovery, and it adversely affects recovery rates. And lastly, we're going to talk about how stigma affects the overall community and society. Remember, if mental illness is something we're not allowed to talk about, or if we consider it to be shameful and of low social value, it does not have a high stature in terms of how governments would spend money. For example, rather than spending money on mental health facilities, you might see a government spend more money on policing. Well, police will be the first to tell you that they're ill-equipped to deal with people who have chronic mental health conditions. But because money is spent more on policing than on mental health, that's where the service ends up being delivered. We could also make the same argument about correctional facilities. We have lots of money that go into those types of settings, and we maybe need to step back and think about the idea that if we spent money on prevention and treatment at the community level, we might get more bang for our buck. But because of stigma, it's difficult to get people to talk about mental health as a thing that all of us need. Instead, everybody can relate to the idea that we need to be safe against criminals, and so this is something that's much more likely to get said to a politician and therefore influence their decisions. What do we see in terms of the money that we put into not only whether or not systems have medical health services for mental health for people with mental health issues, but the quality of those services and where they're located. The same thing is true for programs like welfare, which is actually called income assistance. How much money do we give to people when we know that many of them are people who have some kind of diagnosis? If we don't value mentally ill people, then we probably don't allocate as much money, and therefore we probably make people endure a lot less dignity and deal with a lot more financial and other stress, which makes their symptoms more likely to be aggravated. Neighborhoods themselves may start to have issues because people may not want to have a facility in their neighborhood. In many cases, people have the belief that putting a facility in their neighborhood will make mentally ill people more likely to show up, when in fact the research shows that it's more likely to actually help people get off the streets. But instead what happens is we start to see that people only put services into neighborhoods that are already sort of falling apart, and sometimes people think of that as what caused the neighborhood to fall apart. So in Mission, for example, you could see neighborhoods that used to be kind of the business center, they start to lose some of their appeal because something new opens up, a new mall or a more modern street front. And so what happens is the businesses in the area that are used to be prominent start losing value, the rents go down, and because organizations that are funded to help with mental illness don't have a lot of money, they're more likely to show up in those neighborhoods that have low rent. And that can send this message to the community that, people with mental illness are low rent people. They don't get to have their services be where they're prominent or where they're easily accessed by buses. And there can be a lot of tension within neighborhoods because businesses sometimes feel that they shouldn't have to share space with facilities for people with mental health needs or addiction issues. Of course, homelessness can result because people may not be able to find the services they need, and they may end up slipping through the cracks. People with homelessness as their issue actually often have a very diverse and unique combination of barriers. But the one thing that we can likely say about many of these people is that their needs are not easily serviced, and the inadequacy of services in a community can play a direct role in whether or not they get help before they fall all the way through the cracks into living a life on the street. The other thing that we might say is a downstream cost of this stigma is whether or not people are willing to access prescription drugs or the actual tested and effective drugs. And a curious thing happens. People go out and they engage in self-medication. So they purchase illicit drugs or they use alcohol to excess. This in itself can funnel money into the criminal organizations and increase the crime rate. So it's a strange thing that people would rather avoid using a prescription drug, but might be open to the idea of using an illegal drug, which is actually probably causing them more harm. So it's funny that we aren't actually probably making things better in terms of the health care that we provide, and that actually can increase the amount of addiction we have in our community. And I haven't even spoken in that example about how not having enough addiction services can actually aggravate this issue. And again, because the society around us often has a negative impression of people with addiction, which is another mental illness, they don't want to put money or have the government put money into services, or they don't want them in their neighborhood. And this can have a larger effect on all of us. Do we all feel more comfortable in our neighborhoods? Do we all feel like there's a place for us if we have a mental health need, or somebody in our family does? And it turns out that but 1 in 5 of us will experience a significant mental illness in our community in our lifetime. And some stats and studies suggest it's actually more like 1 in 2 of us. So if it's such a common thing, wouldn't it be a comfort to you to know that when and if this happens to you or somebody in your family, you would be able to get the help that you need, as opposed to feeling like you were going to be shuffled off to a neighborhood which is undervalued, or be treated like a criminal, or have to search and hope that you found services before things got too out of hand. The last part of this whole assignment asks you to think about what you can do to influence stigma. So go back to what we talked about at the very beginning. Think about what you can and should not do. Where do you spend your money? What do you tell the media itself? How much of an advocate are you within your community? What messages do you send to your children? What words do you use in day-to-day life? Who do you associate with? When, for example, you find out that somebody in your family or circle of friends has a mental health need, do you come to their assistance, or do you back off and withdraw? So think about what you as an individual can do to help reduce stigma at each of these levels of the community, from dealing with individuals to families to neighborhoods to the country and even to the entire planet. Okay? Thanks very much, and I hope this has been helpful to you. I'll also post the slides separately so that you can download them. Take care.